tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show. When the Ontario election was going on, I got all these angry messages, not angry, but pointed messages from people in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and parts of BC saying, oh, you're focused too much on Ontario. And when I've talked about Alberta and Saskatchewan in the past, I get the messages from the Ontarians saying, you're focused too much on the West. So, to be honest, the Maritimers, you guys have a right to be aggrieved right now, because I don't spend nearly enough time talking about what's going on in the Maritimes and also in Newfoundland and Labrador. We'll get to you if stuff starts happening there. But one thing I do want to start talking about a little bit, though, because we have the United Conservative Party leadership race, is what's happening there in the bid to not just replace Jason Kenney as UCP leader, but whoever wins this race will become Premier of Alberta. A lot like what's happening in the UK right now, where whoever wins the Tory leadership race gets right to the top spot and becomes Prime Minister. So let's talk about this and some of the other broad issues here. Joining me is Rachel Emmanuel, who is True North's new Alberta correspondent. Rachel, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show today, and welcome aboard.
Yeah, thank you very much. Happy to be on the show and happy to be with True North. I know we've had some conversations about me maybe joining the team a couple of times, so it's great to be here at last. I'm really excited about it.
And just as a wee bit of Rachel Emmanuel trivia, you were there like 5 seconds before I was pepper sprayed in Ottawa covering the Freedom Convoy. I ran into you in front of the Chateau Laurier. You had the wherewithal to get out of Dodge. I was pepper sprayed moments later. I don't blame you for it, but you were there at the moment it happened, or at least just before. So good to see you. Well, I actually have vision in both eyes right now. Let's start off with what's been happening in Alberta politics generally, because we have Jason Kenney, who effectively lost his leadership review, and very quickly a huge leadership race coming. It's wide open. You've got all these ex-cabinet ministers that are coming in. Is there at this point a theme or a thing that this leadership race is about?
I think that depends on who you are as a voter and what you're looking for in the next leader. I think we're seeing two big questions, as what always happens in a leadership race. You have a camp of people who are really just thinking who can win a general election. And so I think what we're seeing with a lot of people that are coming out of Kenney's government, they're saying with some of the other candidates, and from their campaigns, I'm hearing concern that maybe candidates like Danielle Smith or Todd Lawton doesn't have what it takes to win a general election, because they are a bit further to the right than some of the candidates that are coming out of Kenney's government. So that's, of course, a question that everyone's asking. Another question is, of course, a lot of people are really unhappy with what the Kenney government did on COVID-19 and the policies that were implemented. Of course, pastors here in Alberta were arrested during the pandemic. That is not something the province is ready to forget anytime soon. So we're really seeing those two themes emerge. And I think everyone is kind of saying, Kenney didn't do enough with the federal government and getting a fair deal from Ottawa. We didn't see the action on that we were hoping for. So I think one of the big questions is who's someone that can win in a general election. Of course, the province has a general election coming up next year, just about 6 months after their leadership race. So that's really not a lot of time. So they're looking for somebody who can, reunite the caucus. The parties is kind of fracturing. There seems to be some divides. It's conservative politics. You always have it in conservative politics. There's different groups. People are very principled, and they're not always willing to bend their views for somebody else's to compromise and make it work. So they're looking for someone that can unite the party and win ahead of a general election coming up against Rachel Notley and the NDP.
Yeah, I think you raise an important point, and one of the things I felt Jason Kenney was always too quick to do, and there was probably a strategic element there, is say that the only criticism about him was really about the COVID handling. He had said that anyone who was against him because they didn't like lockdowns, they didn't like vaccine mandates. He tried to really do his own version of the fringe minority thing to some extent. And what you just mentioned there, a range of issues that people had with the Kenney government, even pre-COVID or in the very early days of COVID. And yeah, the fair deal. I mean, obviously it hasn't been top of mind for a lot of Albertans because of pandemic-related stuff, but the equalization referendum was really, I think, for a lot of people, just the beginning of a bigger discussion they want to have about independence that really wasn't happening.
Yeah, that's exactly it. There was a lot of unhappiness with the COVID-19 pandemic policies, as you mentioned, but there was also a lot of resentment for other issues. That being said, I don't know if COVID hadn't happened, if Kenney still would have had the same leadership and zero results that he had. And, maybe his energy could have been spent more on some of these issues. Obviously, COVID-19 was overwhelming for the government, and it seemed like sort of all hands on deck to address this issue. And Kenney, of course, was the person who came out and did the press conferences. I think he was in front of the cameras like 3 times a week. We didn't see that in every other province. Some premiers put their, health officer in front of the cameras. So it's kind of like you've just spent 2 years seeing Kenney in front of the camera, delivering bad news repeatedly. And then we go into this leadership review. But certainly now that we are looking for a new premier, there's other issues coming up that people had with the Kenney government. And another big thing I'm hearing a lot is just sort of a lack of communication. Albertans didn't really feel like the Kenney government was consulting with them or being clear and open with them about what they were doing on the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it really felt like a top-down approach that Albertans typically really don't appreciate. I don't know if we really see that same sentiment in Ontario. The politics are very different here. So we're seeing some leadership candidates appeal to, we need to communicate better. We need to kind of give the power back to the hands of the members and not have that top-down approach. So these are all issues that we're seeing flow out of the leadership race right now and things that people are talking about and discussing.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the players here, because you have a lot of former Kenney cabinet ministers, people like Rajan Sawhney and Leela here and Travis Taves that have stepped forward, Rebecca Schultz, another one who just got a pretty, I'd say, significant endorsement in Ronna Ambrose coming aboard her campaign. And then you have that wild rose flank of Brian Jean and Danielle Smith. And you've got some other people. I mean, Todd Lowen, I don't think he's in that top tier right now, but to be fair, he's there and he's appealing to some of those same people. And I think it will be interesting to see which way this goes, even early on, as far as momentum and fundraising and all that, because I would see, certainly from my perspective, and I could have my own little echo chamber here, I would say that there's a lot more momentum behind the Danielle Smiths and the Brian Jeans because of those COVID frustrations, because of those equalization referendum and broader Western alienation frustrations. But at the same time, if someone is happy with the Kenney government, there's a lot of appeal to people that were in that government, like Rebecca Schultz, like Travis Taves.
You have it exactly right. So I'm seeing tons of support for Danielle Smith. I don't think anybody on any campaigns, maybe a couple people, but I've been here at the Calgary Stampede talking to everyone. Everyone seems to be pretty much on agreement. Smith is in the lead right now. She's the clear front runner. The polling from last month showed Brian Jean was just behind her, like a point behind her, still within the margin of error. I'm not really hearing a lot of support for him at the Stampede. I'm not hearing that people feel super confident in his campaign or believe that he's likely to become the next leader, even though the polling, as I mentioned last month, showed him just behind Smith. But I am hearing, people think Smith is the clear front runner. And that's because she has done such a good job of appealing to those freedom-loving Albertans who are so frustrated with what happened in their province over the last 2 years. And the thing that all politicians need to remember right now is a lot of people who are in the freedom movement are people that were never involved in politics before. But when they saw what was happening in their country during the COVID-19 pandemic, they thought, I need to get involved now. If there was ever a time to stand up for something, it's today. And so they've been organizing over the last 2 years. So this has mobilized a lot of Canadians who might not have been involved in politics before. There's just massive email lists. Their organization is very excellent. It's one of the reasons that Kenney had to resign as premier following, his poor leadership review results at just 51.4% of party support. So she's done a really good job of appealing to those people. She's been very clear, we're not going to do lockdowns again. If Ottawa pressures us, we're going to have to resist that pressure on vaccine mandates and lockdowns. And then, she's been talking about an Alberta Sovereignty Act, which would mean the province wouldn't enforce federal laws that they didn't like or think were advantageous to Alberta. So she's been very clear at appealing to those to those Albertans, and even things on like nominations. Nominations are open during the leadership race. Some people think that shouldn't be the case. They think they should wait for the new leader to be chosen to open noms. And she said, if the members in that area are unhappy, I would consider reopening nominations. And that is some of the more moderates a bit concerned because they think some of these ideas are a bit radical, like reopening nominations, what kind of legal issues could that cause, as well as, an Alberta Sovereignty Act. Is it really something that's practical? Will it give us economic certainty? I think we'll see a lot of investment pull, but she's definitely pulling ahead right now because she's appealing to those people. And I think they've just organized so well and so efficiently over the last 2 years. The concerns I'm hearing with her campaign is whether or not she can win a general election. And I don't have a lot of clear answers on that. I'm not hearing a lot of clear answers about that at this time.
Just on that note, and I know you're a relatively recent Alberta transplant, but there was a lot of bad blood to Danielle Smith after the whole floor crossing debacle, and she's had to answer to that time and time again. But Have people forgiven that? Have they forgotten it? Or has the political discussion just changed so much that they're operating on a different wavelength now? The people that were against her, a lot of them came from that Wild Rose side, the right flank of the party. Have they just moved on from that entirely?
I don't think anybody's forgotten about it. I think it's something that's always there in the back of people's minds. It's something that gets brought up very often. It's just, I think she spent 6 years on the radio, and I think a lot of people have forgiven her for it, and they're ready to give her another chance. So that's one big part of it. As I mentioned, there are still some people that hold on to it. People have pretty clear, when you're speaking to people, it's pretty clear right away. They say, I'll never trust her again because of the floor crosser. Or they say, you know what, we heard her on the radio for 6 years. We understand why that happened and where she was coming from. It's a different time now. So there's definitely a big wave of people that are ready to forgive her. They might not have forgotten that it's happened, but they understand why it happened. And I think that, as we saw with Ralph Klein, who was one of Alberta's most popular premiers, if you have a political leader who's willing to say, I made a mistake, and explain to people what that mistake was and why they made it, people are very quick to forgive them and move on from it. And I think that was, again, one of the criticisms with Kenney, is people didn't feel like they got a clear answer from him or a clear owning of mistakes, just sort of we did the best we could, and people just were not satisfied with his answer. So I do get the sentiment that people are ready to forgive her. There's of course people that are not going to believe her or trust her again as a politician, but the sentiments definitely seem to be changing.
Let's turn to some of the bigger picture stuff. Obviously, you're coming aboard not just as True North's next Alberta correspondent, but really, I think, as True North's first Alberta correspondent. We've had Alberta coverage. I know a lot of it has fallen on me, which is just what Albertans want. Someone coming in from Ontario every time something happens to report on it, even though I do have an Alberta sensibility, many have argued. But what is it that you think are the big issues on the Alberta agenda right now?
AHS. People are really unhappy with their healthcare, and they're looking for someone who's saying we cannot have unelected public health officials making decisions for the province again. So they're looking for political leaders that are going to offer answers on that.
Just to jump in there, do you think this is like a general concern that everyone in Canada is dealing with, or do you think it's a particularly acute for Albertans?
It's definitely a concern that conservatives, libertarians across Canada are feeling right now. And I'm hearing it brought up in Alberta politics at the grassroots level at local meetings all the time. It gets talked about all the times. People are saying, this is really a problem of how our public system is designed and the problem with AHS. So how can we redesign our public health system so that we don't have a situation like this again? And again, candidates like Danielle Smith and Todd Lawton, they have specific solutions and they have ideas as to how to address this, so that we don't have public health orders that are just passed without, public officials, elected officials, being able to debate them in the legislature and decide if they're actually something they'd like to proceed with. So I would say AHS is at the top of mind. Again, freedom from Ottawa, some more fairment on equalization payments. People are really unhappy with the high taxes right now and the high cost of living. Government spending is, of course, an issue. Those are the big issues that I'm seeing come across the board right now that get kind of brought up everywhere that we're going. But affordability is, I think, top of mind for everybody in Canada. So we're seeing a lot of conversation around that as well.
During the early part of the Conservative leadership race, keeping in mind you don't really have any candidates from the West. I know Pierre Poilievre was born there, so he's tried to say that he's the Western candidate. Leslyn Lewis did very well there in the last leadership race, so she's trying to say that that makes her a Western candidate. But you have Ontarians and a Quebecer that are running in this race, and it really didn't seem like Alberta issues or Western issues were getting much discussion at all in the leadership race until I'd say the last week. Once they all want to go to Alberta and get their white hats for the Calgary Stampede, they start talking about, I want to change equalization and all that. But do you feel that there has been enough of a push by the federal Conservative leadership candidates to go after these Western issues?
I think so. I think they've all done different things to sort of try to appeal to the West. The question is whether they really mean it and if we'll see action on that once they're elected. I think, everyone knows, even Patrick Brown, very early into his campaign, when Michelle Rumpel-Garner was still his campaign chair, he released a whole platform on how he would deal with issues in the West. We saw something similar from Jean Charest, I believe it was just early last week. So, they are coming out with proposals that specifically address Western issues. It's just the question of how much they really mean it and how much they're going to advocate for these issues once they're in elected office and hold the highest office of the land. So I think that's sort of a question everyone is wondering, trustability. But, Pierre Poilievre is incredibly popular out here. He's pulled massive crowds to his rallies in Edmonton. There was 4,000 people at his rally, a couple months ago. So he's just pulling massive crowds all across Canada. And we're definitely seeing like a ton of support for him here. So, maybe he hasn't lived in Calgary anytime soon, but I think people still like to see him a little bit as one of their own.
True North, Alberta correspondent Rachel Emmanuel. Rachel, thanks for coming on and welcome again to the team. Great to be working with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.